Thanks for staying with us. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the US clears the way for sanctions over Sudan's conflict as the latest ceasefire fails to silence the shelling. There's relief and tears for Nigerians and South Africans finally back home after fleeing the war. Also, Tokyo offers help to Mozambique in battling insurgents in the oil-rich north who forced a lucrative gas project to a halt. Japan's prime minister's on the six-country tour of the continent. And we head to Senegal and tune into the first Pan-African festival celebrating TV series produced on the continent. But first, Joe Biden signed an executive order that would allow him to bring in new sanctions over Sudan's conflict. The US president called a 3-week-long war a betrayal of the Sudanese people. About 700 are conservatively thought to have been killed so far. A ceasefire between the army and the RSF paramilitary it's battling again failed to stop the fighting on Thursday. Gunfire continued throughout Khartoum. More than 100,000 people have fled the country. The first group of several thousand Nigerians stranded in Sudan have made it back to Abuja. 376 arrived home on planes that finally left Egypt after several days of delay at the border. Meanwhile, South Africa welcomed some of its citizens who'd been on a cargo ship off the Sudanese coast since the war broke out. Nadine Tron has more.
Family members of the last South Africans to return from Sudan cried tears of joy and relief as they saw the plane carrying their loved ones land at Cape Town International Airport. Although a passenger ship was waiting to transport them from the port of Sudan to the port of Safaga in Egypt, the South Africans delayed their trip and returned to Sudan to allow for citizens from other countries to join them. People from Angola, Zimbabwe, Lesotho and even the United States were then returned to their home countries via Egypt. The evacuation mission of 22 people from war-stricken Sudan was a combined effort between a ship repairs company, Project Africa, the disaster relief organisation Gift of the Givers and the South African government.
We're here now. That's important. Oh, great. It's great to be back.
I didn't know if they were going to come back home again.
What had to be a 3 to 4 day trip became an 8-day trip. Because on our way, my mother... Our company made the conscious decision from a humanitarian aspect. Yes, we're going to be 3 days longer at sea, but a lot more lives will be saved.
Many of the evacuees did not have passports, cash or any way of getting out of Sudan. The situation was complicated by the closure of all consular services due to the war. Staff of the South African embassy in Cairo is said to have gone above and beyond to make the mission a success, travelling 34 hours and spending an enormous amount of time on backroom diplomacy. Gift of the Givers is concerned about the thousands of people who are still stranded at Sudanese borders.
Burkina Faso has acknowledged that 136 bodies were found in a mass grave in the north last week. The official toll had been 60. Amnesty International's put that even higher at 147, accusing the army over the killings. Sophie Lamotte with more.
2 weeks after the Khartoum massacre, where roughly 150 civilians were killed by men dressed in military attire, the Burkinabe government met with civil society actors and accused extremist groups of using treacherous methods, such as dressing up in military attire to conduct their attacks. The statement comes just days after human rights groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch accused the Burkinabe army of being behind that massacre. For Amnesty International, civilians who are often considered to be complicit with terrorists have repeatedly been targeted by the army as reprisal.
The army, and more particularly the BIR, the Bataillon d'Intervention Rapide, entered the village, gathered all the people, and started burn down several buildings, but also killed 150 civilians, including children. We are seeing a kind of pattern of what appears to be a punitive expedition that is very similar to that of the killings in Nuna in December, where the army or the the VDPs or those supporting the army deliberately decide to target civilians in reprisal for the attacks against military bases or groups.
Neither the government nor terrorist groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda operating in the region have yet claimed nor denied responsibility for the attack. If Amnesty International's findings are confirmed, the Khartoum massacre would be considered the worst massacre perpetrated by the Burkinabe army since the start of the war launched by jihadist groups against the state in 2015.
One of Kenya's most well-known televangelists has been released on bail. Pastor Ezekiel Odero is being investigated for his ties to Paul Mackenzie, the leader of a suicidal doomsday cult in Kilifi County, whose followers were instructed to fast to death in order to meet Jesus at the end of the world. Odero is also being investigated for the deaths of 15 of his followers under separate circumstances. Police, however, have said that in this case, there was no evidence of a crime. Tokyo's pledged to help Mozambique in the pushback against Islamist extremists in the oil-rich north. Japan's one of the world's biggest importers of liquefied natural gas. And its prime minister was in the Mozambican capital on Thursday, on the final day of a 6-day tour aimed at countering China's influence in Africa. Carice Garland has more.
On a mission to strengthen relations and cultivate business partnerships. As part of his tour of 4 African countries, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met with Kenyan President William Ruto on Wednesday. Japan is hoping to counter the influence of China and Russia in the region, particularly in the lead-up to the G7 summit, where members are expected to issue their strongest condemnation yet of the war in Ukraine.
Japan would like to directly hear the voices of African countries and make sure that those voices are reflected in discussions at the G7 Hiroshima summit this month.
Kishida's Africa tour also includes Egypt, Ghana and Mozambique, countries that have formed close ties with China in recent years. Beijing is Kenya's leading import partner, and trade between the two countries has increased 30-fold since the year 2000. More broadly, China spends more than $4 billion a year in foreign direct investment in African businesses, a figure expected to keep growing. This is on top of billions more in infrastructure investments as part of the Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. To provide alternatives to Beijing, Japan has teamed up with India in launching the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, a cooperation agreement focusing on quality infrastructure and digital connectivity.
The conditions for journalists in Africa are bad in about a third of the continent. That's one of the findings of NGO Reporters Sans Frontières in its World Press Freedom Rankings released this week. But it's not all bad news. Namibia and South Africa have some of the greatest press freedoms in the world. Meanwhile, Eritrea does rank 174th out of 180 countries. Senegal slipped 31 places to 104th, not far behind its war-torn neighbour Mali. Sam Bradpiece has more from Dakar.
Senegal's drop down the World Press Freedom Rankings is the biggest of any African country this year, and not without good reason. Over the past 12 months, journalists have been arrested, attacked, placed under investigation and even imprisoned for various alleged offences ranging from defamation to spreading fake news. But in reality, many of those who found themselves in difficulty have simply taken a line critical to the authorities. One prominent example is Pap Ndiaye, who's been behind bars since March for allegedly spreading fake news and offending a magistrate. RSF, the organisation behind the rankings, also noted that journalists face difficulties on the ground here in Senegal when covering protests. I personally witnessed just a couple of months ago police beating up a journalist for Agence France Presse. When you look at the bigger picture, all of this is worrying, particularly as we head into next year's election season.
And finally, the first ever Pan-African Festival for TV series is underway in Senegal, called, fittingly, Dakar Series. It's running until the 6th. Our correspondents report.
Marie-Germaine and Nali rarely miss their favourite show. They watch new episodes 3 times a week. Déchéance has been on for nearly 3 months now and follows the story of a group of young girls grappling with the dangers of life in the city.
It's a very interesting and enlightening series. It reflects the realities of society, what young people go through. It talks about incest and young girls who work as prostitutes to make ends meet.
Les jeunes filles qui se prostituent pour subvenir à leurs besoins.
Kilo ko dal mbam sax tane nako sa tante bi mom sax nit la fo xana ci du sa mbokk.
Déchéance is the latest creation of Marodi Studios, which made the hit show Maîtresse d'un homme marié, which drew international attention. There are 50 episodes scheduled for the first season alone. The cast and crew are young. Penda is acting for the first time, playing the role of Linda.
I'm delighted to have been chosen above the others. It's a new challenge for me, because I'm nothing like my character Linda in reality.
Déchéance is already an online success. There are about 2 million views per episode on YouTube. The director, Bai Moussa, says we are living through a revolution in African series production.
Now there are lots of Senegalese series. People are watching them even more than foreign ones. People watching abroad are even adding subtitles.
Inspired by this success, production companies are blooming in Dakar. Some harbour hopes of one day rivaling Nollywood, Nigeria's creative juggernaut.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.